I am going to start, and I will start. I will have my computer search for the right source sheet. Again, my deep apologies to everybody here. As I popped up the source sheet, I see that I sent in one that was similarly named. I am Rabbi Dov Linzer. I'm the Rosh HaYeshiva and president of YCT Rabbinical School. I want to welcome everybody here, say how what a thrill it is to have us all learning together. One of these days we will learn together in person, but it's really great to be once again gathering for the Yemei Iyun, and in particular, I think that the fact that we schedule at this time of year, which is relatively recent, and have a special track for the Yamim Noraim is really a great way to prepare. Even the parts that are about Torah, Nevi'im, and Nach, I think that often, certainly in the yeshivot and in the broader community, are not frequently enough engaged in a serious way. And I think that in certain ways, they put us more directly connected to Dvar Hashem in more of a sort of spiritual mindset than an intellectual one. And I think that's particularly important for this time of year. And the topic today is going to be one relating to one relating to Shemitah, because we are also with this Rosh Hashanah about to enter into the Shemitah year. So it will be an interesting challenge if I can't find the source sheets, and we'll have to do it all without sources. I do know that some people feel that there's too many sources sometimes in in the shiurim. And I did once show up on Shabbos Hagadol to give the Shabbos Hagadol lecture, and I said to the rabbi there, I said, so where are the source sheets I sent in? So the rabbi said, source sheets? What source sheets? So this might be a similar experience. So I do ask for your indulgence.
It's Yonah Berman. Rabbi Linzer, quick question. Would it help if I or Aaron did some screen sharing for you from sources that you told us to find online in the meantime?
That's not a bad idea. We can definitely start with the psukim. We're going to look at, but you know what, let's see how well we do in terms of just doing it without any source, without sources. It's going to be an interesting challenge, but if people give me time, I will pull up the sources as is relevant. I'll sort of use Bar Ilan. So, but I do appreciate it, and we'll do it all together in the spirit of generosity of spirit. So the question that we're going to be looking at today is the nature of the Shemitah year in terms of the way it is referred to in the Torah. And the Torah actually refers to it as two ways. One way is that the word Shemitah. And let's take a look at that. Again, I will sort of see. I am going to try to see what I can do sort of parallel. So the Torah says twice. It says Shamot kol ba'al mashe yado asher yashev re'ehu. That everybody, any person who, here we go. I will be able to use Bar Ilan. So let's do a screen share. Okay, here we go. Is this visible? Let's maybe do it even a larger font. Okay, so here we have in Dvarim, Miketz Sheva Shanim Ta'aseh Shemitah. At the end of 7 years, you shall make a Shemitah. V'zeh Dvar HaShemitah, this is the matter of the Shemitah. Shamot kol ba'al mashe yado asher yashev re'ehu. Every person who has a debt in his hands that he levies against his friend shall release it. He should not pressure his neighbor and his brother, because it has been declared a Shemitah to God. So we do not exact the loan. As an Achriti goes, a non-Jew, you can exact the loan, but the money that is owed to you from your brother, you should release. And then, unless you have no poor people among you. So here the mitzvah of Shemitah is the annulment of loans, and the word that the Torah uses is release, is Shemitah. Now, if we look earlier in the Torah, and again, please, we will find the following. I misspelled. Whoops. Oh, come on. I do appreciate everybody's tolerance. Okay, here we go. Okay, this is in Mishpatim. 6 years plant your land. People see this, we're on Pasuk Yud. The asafta es tuasa, you shall gather in the grain. The hashvi'it, and on the 7th year, tishmetena unitashta, you shall, there's the word shemot again, you shall release it and abandon it. The achlu evyonei amecha, the poor shall eat from it. The yitram, and what they leave over, tochal chayat hasadeh, the animals shall eat. So shall you do for your vineyard and for your olives. And then rest on the Shabbos day, in order that your shorcha v'chamorcha, then your animals can rest. So one thing I'll mention as a little aside is that Shabbat here is not, and I'll sort of ask for people, Rabbi Berman, is it okay to ask for people to like verbally join in, or is everything you want to do be through the chat? Okay, is Rabbi Berman not here? Aaron,
I can take that one. I think it is. We would prefer not to use the chat because when the messages come up, they block the closed captioning.
Okay.
So
is it okay if people then just turn off their mute so I can ask a question to the audience?
We currently have everybody unable to ask to unmute themselves. Yeah.
So, all right. So we'll have to be rhetorical questions then. Hopefully
people can raise their hands if they want to answer. That will work well.
All right, great. So we'll do that next time. So one thing I'll point out is that it's interesting about Shabbat that it does not mention what we normally associate with Shabbat, which is God made the world in 6 days. What it mentions here is that the purpose to rest is to let your animals and those, among you rest. It is about the value of, if you would, like Shemitah, about release, about not demanding work from those under you for 7 days a week. And actually, I would encourage you to compare the way Shabbat is described in the first of the Aseret HaDibrot and in the second, because the second one does not mention creation. The second one mentions you were slaves and God has released you and you shall keep the Shabbat because you also cannot enslave, literally or figuratively, those under you, animals and people, constantly. You have to actually allow them one day. So the relevance of that here is that it's a similar theme to Shemitah. The Shemitah here is what? You allow it, you release it, and the poor eat from it, and the animals eat from it. So here it is as well. There's a year where even if you are wealthy, there are plenty of people who don't own land, who don't have the ability. And on the Shemitah, you release all of your produce and you allow them to participate in the food that the land grows. So Shemitah here, like Shemitah, and again, I'll remind you that the word is release. Shemitah here, like Shemitah that we saw before about releasing debts, is to take care of the poor. Now, because now we have commercial debts and so on, but in the time of the Torah, people borrowed money only because they could not feed their family. And that's also why there's no interest, because the more, if there's interest, you just get deeper and deeper into a hole. And I should mention, again, this is a lecture in itself, but I should mention that in the Torah, people are going to be shocked and challenge me, and I encourage you to research this and write me in. The Torah never speaks about giving a gift of money. It speaks about like the tithe and so on. It never speaks that if a poor person comes to you, you give a gift of money. It says if a poor person comes to you, you open up your hand, but that is about lending money. That is not about giving money. Lending money also allows a person to keep their dignity greater. The problem with lending money is that the person might not have the money to pay back, and they could get deeper and deeper into debt. So the Torah has two amazing innovations to prevent this from happening. Innovation number one is you don't pay interest, which is tremendous sacrifice. I am giving you my money. You might never be able to pay me back, so I'm putting it at risk. And I don't get anything out of it. It's all lose on my perspective. So it is a type of a tzedakah, okay? But it's a more dignified tzedakah than a straight gift. There's a whole issue about Hebrew free loan and how that actually, in addition to all of that, because you have to pay it back, it encourages investing in it and developing greater means of sufficiency. And then if the money is paid back, then the same money can be lent to the next person. So there's a real power that we have forgotten about the sort of Torah's idea of loans rather than gifts. So I said that there were two innovations. Innovation number one is no interest. So you're not going to get deeper in debt. Okay, but maybe, yes, I'm supposed to use the money and sort of buy a push cart, and maybe, which actually happened, right? When the Jewish immigrants, how they were able to become more industrious. But the reality was I had to feed my family or my business failed, and I don't have the money to pay back. And I'm in a position not only about feeling guilty, and particularly a power differential. Like if it's about maintaining my dignity, to know that I owe money that I can't pay back. And every time I see this guy on the street, I sort of feel that low sort of relationship to him. The Gemara quotes the verse, the borrower is the slave to the lender. And that's a type of a mentality that sets in. So the Torah has another solution. And the solution is Shemitah. You release the debts every 7 years. I borrow the money, I try to pay you back genuinely, I'm not getting deeper in debt, and if at the end of 7 years I can't pay you back, it gets wiped. And I should say, that's something we really have lost sight of. And I remember a few years ago, I guess it was 7 years ago, I'm trying to remember who it was. It was one of the Knesset members. I don't know if it was Tzipi Livni or maybe somebody here remembers. It was definitely a woman. And she proposed that that Israel, the state of Israel, actually erased a lot of debts, not that are owned between people, that wouldn't be fair, but that are owed to the state from people that are in a sort of lower economic level. I don't know if she actually succeeded in getting that passed, but that would be amazing, and a real owning of this value. So that is Shemitah, the releasing. And here it is the releasing of produce, not the giving of produce, but the releasing of produce. And this is another point in terms of the issue of dignity. If you think about it, right, there is a tithe every, that is given like once out of every 3 years. That's a direct gift to the poor. I winnow my grain, I take a tenth and I give it to the poor. But every year there's a more ongoing way in which the poor are sustained. And what is that? Maybe somebody can raise their hand. How, again, it's lending money that we mentioned, but there's a regular type of way within an agricultural society which sustains the poor every year. Anybody want to raise their hand? I welcome you to raise their hand. And Aaron, since I can't see it, you should call on people or ask them to put it in the chat. I'm getting any response? No, nothing yet. Okay, so I will jump in and I will say that that is, the gifts like the sheaf that is forgotten. Think about Megillat Ruth, right? The gleanings, the things that fall, the things that are forgotten, and so on. And if you have that image in your mind about Megillat Ruth, you're seeing that there are the workers of the field, and maybe after they're done, they're the poor come in and they go through it and they pick things up. And talking about the issue of dignity, the idea of not just getting a handout, but going through a field, it's almost like you sweep it up and you get to keep what you sweeped up. You're sort of cleaning it out, but you're in the field, you're taking the grain. There's something that feels a little bit more like you also relate to the land and are working, and certainly not as much of a straight gift. So the Shemitah is something similar. The Shemitah says you don't collect all of your stuff and give it to the poor. You release it. And the land is treated as equal access to everyone. It's not my land for this year. And everybody is equal and everybody can come in and take the produce. So there's, again, not only does it provide for them, but provide for them hopefully in a way that creates a somewhat of a greater dignity, a greater sense of equality. So that's what we have here. Now, what is missing from the aspect of Shemitah that we think about in terms of the land? Can anybody think about what is missing? I'll read the verses again. 6 years you shall plant your land and gather its grain. And on the 7th year, you shall release it and abandon it. And the poor will eat with you. And the poor of the people shall eat. And the remainder the animals will eat. And so shall you do with your vineyard and your olive. So here is the poor participating and eating. But something is missing here in relationship to Shemitah and the land. What is it? Or maybe don't look at the verse. Let's say I asked you, what's the basic laws of Shemitah? What's the first thing we know about Shemitah? What do you do? What do you not do? Oh, there is a hand raised. Richard Shore. So here we go. Richard, what do you do?
There's no Shabbat Ta'aret.
Right.
No
What's
Shabbat
missing
on
here
land.
is not working the land. That is not mentioned. It never says here, don't work the land. Now you'll tell me it says abandon it, release it. But what are you abandoning and releasing? What's in verse 6? Yes, it speaks about planting, but what's the noun that's at the end of verse 6? You shall gather the grain, and on the 7th year you shall release it. It's in the feminine, by the way, tfu'ata. You shall release it, okay? And the poor shall eat from it. So this is about not keeping the grain to yourself. There is no aspect here of not working the land. It may be a suggestion because at 6 years you plant, okay, which means on the 7th year you don't plant. But that is certainly not the emphasis. The emphasis is don't gather your grain to yourself, but allow the poor to take a part of it. That's what you have in these verses about Shemitah. Now let us compare that to what we have in the Torah in terms of the other place Shemitah appears, in which Richard told us was correctly about rest. So let's see if we can sort of pick that up here. And that is in Bahar. Try to remember which parak it is in the Torah. I think let's try that. Nope. Nope. Okay. Nope. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So from the beginning here, Per Kafeh. And God spoke to Moshe on Har Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come to the land that I give you, the land shall rest, V'shavta ha'aretz, a rest to God, Shabbat l'Hashem. 6 years you shall plant your field, and 6 years you shall, harvest your vine, and you shall gather up the grain. Notice the same planting and gathering, similar to what we saw before. But now let's see what you do. What is the contrast of the 7th year? And on the 7th year, it is a Shabbat Shabbaton, a certain day of rest. It shall be for the land, a Shabbat for God. Do not plant your field and do not harvest your vine. The remnants of what you harvest, you shall not, of your cutting, you shall not cut, and the grapes you shall not harvest, meaning those that grow by themselves. It is a year of Shabbat to God. And the Shabbat of the land shall be for you to eat, for you and your servant and your maidservant, and to those that dwell amongst you. And for the animals that are in your land, all of the grain shall be to eat. So the end verses speak about eating the grain. But the emphasis on this is, what is the word that is being repeated again and again? The word is Shabbat. Any guesses how many times the word Shabbat appears in these opening verses? If you guessed 7, you were right. Yes, Ravur is holding up 7. So it's hard to escape the theme of Shabbat. Shabbat, 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 Shabbat LaHashem. Now, I'm not going to sort of discuss now what that idea of Shabbat fully is, how one can imagine it. Maybe I'll suggest, there are two ways to think about what Shabbat here is. It's not the emphasis of tishmitena, of release, taking care of your poor. It's about allowing the land to rest. So we can think of that in one of two ways. We can think about that, and both of which, are ways of thinking about Shabbat. Yes, Shabbat testifies to God creating the world, but what is the sort of value of not working beyond the testifying that God created the world and beyond the taking care of those that work for you, which is that other dimension that we mentioned? So one way of understanding this is, again, the sense of mastery over the world and ultimately being able to let go. The human being is created, and the mandate, the first mandate is, you shall take dominion over the land. That God wants us to, to take ownership, to develop it, to inhabit it. That's our mandate. Before you get to Shabbat, right? It's like, it's Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod. We have with us Rav Uri Topolowski, and I remember he once came and spoke at the yeshiva on the topic of kashrus, and he shared with us that when he speaks to his congregants, he says to them, what is the first mitzvah that they were given in Gan Eden? So everybody thinks it's like, don't eat from the tree of Eitz Hadath. And he says, no, the first mitzvah was Mikol Eitz Hagan Achol Tuchem. You have to first eat from everything else. Enjoy the world. So here, 6 days you're supposed to work, but there is a day that you stop working, that you recognize that, that ultimately, the responsibility of the power, first of all, of control, the same way we control our power of eating, we control our power of sex, our creative power, whatever, we have to restrain it to recognize the world is not just about us projecting ourselves in the world. We have to be able to use it for good. We have to exert restraint. We have to recognize that ultimately, God is in the world. God is the one who gives us this power. So there definitely is an element about that sense of ownership and control. And there also, I would say, is a sense in terms of Shabbat about devoting one's energies to God. Not sort of being busy with one's work and having a holy day to devote to God. And one could certainly imagine this as well in the context of a year, and when people take a sabbatical, they don't call it a Shemitah, they call it a Shnat Shabbaton. By the way, I've been here at the yeshiva for 20 years. I'm owed 3 sabbaticals, so I'll be living in Israel for the next 3 years. I'm just kidding. But anyway, so that is the theme here. It is Shabbat for the land. And it is not about Shemitah. It is not about releasing to the poor, releasing debts, releasing the food. It is true at the end, it speaks about, you share with that which comes out of the rest, you can eat it. You don't have to not eat it, but you're starting by resting it, and what you have, you eat and you share. So what is not emphasized here is the release, the Shemitah, and the taking care of the poor. That is not the goal. The goal here is not taking care of the poor. It is, you and they eat equally from what is released, but that's secondary. The goal is allowing the land to rest. Now, that is completely missing from the prior section. And I want to ask you, so we have two ideas, Shemitah and Shabbaton. Shemitah is about the poor, releasing debts, releasing produce. Shabbaton is about Shabbat, a concept of withdrawing from our mastery of the land, recognizing God, a year of rest, a Shabbat for the land. Anything about the stuff going to the poor is secondary. So presumably we embrace both of these. But there becomes a practical problem by bringing these two together. Because Shabbat, as I said, is not mentioned when it speaks about the primacy or the prime emphasis on taking care of the poor. What happens when we put them both together? We put together the Shabbat and the Shemitah. So the Shabbat is leave the land, don't work it. And the Shemitah is release the produce to the poor. Why does that combination actually undermine one of the goals that we're trying to accomplish? Aaron, you can monitor if anybody's raising their hands.
I'm looking. I don't.
All right,
see
maybe I'll
anybody.
ask the question again in a slightly different way, which is, if one embraces Shabbaton, and doesn't work the land, does that have any impact on allowing it to be a year where the poor are provided for? What would be the best thing to provide for the poor for that year? Ravuri wants to say something, but reading his sign language, he is saying, you work the land and then you leave the produce for the poor. Okay, Michael,
We have
is
a
that
couple
what
of
you
hands
wanted to
now.
say? Mark? Yes?
I
Yeah,
unmuted
same
Mark.
thing, right. Right. To the extent you leave the land fallow, you've got less food for the poor. So
Right, I mean, other than
Pretty
the
straightforward, yeah.
orchards, Michael is agreeing. Other than the orchards, like what's gonna grow? Some random seeds that fall. So you ain't gonna do so much. The poor aren't gonna do so well by leaving it to them if you're not planting. Now, it's pretty hard to ask people, plant and work the land, and then at the end, like, don't, harvest any of it. Everybody is equal. So that might be unrealistic. But the full combination of these two really compromises the aspect of Shemitah. And therefore, it's significant that the Shabbaton is not mentioned at all in the psukim that speaks about Shemitah and having the poor eat from it. So what I would like to turn to now, doing a pretty good job here without any source sheets, right? I just hope the Hebrew is not too difficult for people without the English translation. So what I would like to turn to now is a Gemara in Chulin that sort of alludes to or points us to this problem. And we will see something of a resolution. This is just like my Shabbos HaGadol brush, I got to tell you. I wound up doing better when I didn't have any sources because I've got to distill it to the few sources that are the most relevant. Okay, let me see here. Okay, so this starts on Vav Amud Bet in Chulin. And it'll seem to start a little off topic, but you will see that it will circle back to being very much on topic. So the Gemara says like this. Okay, Ha'id, it is 4 lines from the bottom. Okay, I've highlighted it. Okay, Ha'id Rabbi Yoshua ben Zaruz ben Chamiv Shel Rabbi Meir. So this rabbi brought forth the final testimony. Lifnei Rabbi, and he testified to Rabbi, al Rabbi Meir, that regarding Rabbi Meir, she'achal aleh shel yerek b'veit sha'an, that he ate like a leaf from a vegetable in Beit Sha'an, without, the point is, without taking Trumotim Ma'asrot, without taking the tithes. Okay, so a trivial thing, we saw him eat a leaf, that means something. Why did he not take the tithes? So it must be that he felt that Beit Sha'an was not sanctified as part of the land of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean it's not in the land of Israel and in the borders of Israel. But as we'll see later, it means that when they came back in the time of Ezra, they didn't sanctify all of the land. And the part that they didn't sanctify, the laws of Trumah and Masrot did not apply. So if Rabbi Meir ate this without taking Trumah and Masrot, what did Rabbi do? V'hitir Rabbi at Beit Sha'an kulo al yado. Rebbe sort of accepted the testimony and said, oh, if Rabbi Meir ate a leaf of Beit Sha'an without taking Trumas and Maasros, then all of Beit Sha'an doesn't have the sanctity of the land of Israel, and you don't have to worry about Trumot and Maasrot. Okay, pretty radical. Felice, we'll get to you in a minute if that's your hand, okay? So that was a very radical position, because you have to imagine that if he's permitting it, the practice until then had been to think that it was sanctified and it was obligated. So he was like going against the entire, norms of practice. So Chibru alav echavu beit aviv, all of his brothers, his family gathered around him, Amrulo, and they said, Makom she'avotecha va'avot avotecha nahagubo isur, a place that your fathers and your fathers' fathers, and remember, Rebbe and his family, they were the Nisi'im, they were not only the religious authority, the political authority, so they really set the standard of practice. And here you are, also, I assume many people here have seen like the Queen on TV, but when you think about royalty, the idea of preserving the traditions, right, it's very central. And here they say, this land, that your forefathers have treated as forbidden without taking Truma Masrot, meaning it's holy, and because it's holy, it's forbidden to eat without taking of the tithes. Atatin hogbo heter. You're going to say, oh, it's all permissible. Okay, where do you get off making this type of an innovation? And this is a very important Gemara in general in terms of thinking about, what does it mean, our responsibility of Torah leaders, when is it proper to make innovations? He's not making up halacha, he's identifying whether this is the land. I found new facts, but how can that allow you to go against this well-established process? Practice. So it says like this. Darash lehen mikrazeh. He read them the following verse. So how is it that so this verse says that Chizkiyahu was a righteous king. One of the things he did was he destroyed the copper snake that Moshe did. Everybody remembers the copper snake, and people would look at it and be healed. And even that story in the Torah is troublesome. It seems almost a little magical, but apparently the verse says it got worse. They would actually bring incense to it. They gave it a name. Presumably they would treat it as a type of an idol. So Chizkiyahu said, I can't let this go on, even though it was made by Moshe. And think about this question here about authority and the weight of authority. This thing that was created by Moshe at God's behest, the time has come to grind it up and destroy it because it had become an avodah zarah. And now he asks not only about the fact that it was Moshe's, handiwork, but what about like the fact that it was only him that did it and nobody else did it? Afsharba Asav Yero also was a righteous king before him, and he didn't destroy it. By Yoshaphat Yero, and Yehoshaphat was a righteous king and didn't destroy it. We knew that they destroyed all the idols. So how could they have left this? And maybe Chizkiyahu should have said, if they left it, it was for good reason, that even though it's become an idol, you don't destroy the thing that Moshe Rabbeinu made. And therefore, maybe you should have just gone with the flow, not try to break the practice, not try to destroy something Moshe made. So what is the story? Ella, but that wasn't the case. His forefathers gave him place that he could fence in for himself, meaning they allowed him to, there's things that we haven't accomplished that you can accomplish. The later generations have the ability to take things in a direction and accomplish something the earlier generations did not. Now, it doesn't mean that they were sitting there and saying, we really want to destroy this snake, but let's leave it for the next generation. It means that whatever reason they had not to do it, maybe there would have been too much resistance. They were afraid because it was Moshe's handiwork. That doesn't mean that we should be slavishly obedient to the previous generations. We have to take the political and Torah responsibility and assess what our issues are and not feel constrained by what was or wasn't done before. Sometimes it's a change in the community. The community needs a different answer. Sometimes it's a change in terms of knowing of the facts. He found out something, evidence about Beit Sha'an. Sometimes it's a change about seeing new avenues open up in halacha. But understand what it means to own Torah religious responsibility. You don't do it sort of trivially or capriciously or lightly, but you step up when it's needed. And again, I think it's such a powerful image, even when it led him not just going against his forefathers, but the very thing that Moshe made. So Afani, me too, I as well, this was something that is my place to say, even if they did not say it before me. Okay, so that is point number one. And I think that, first of all, it's just a lovely story. And even if we're not learning Shemitah, we could spend an hour like just appreciating and unpacking this story and the power of Torah leadership, and how sometimes you have to go ahead and do what is necessary. But it's also a very important background to the part that comes next that will sort of make us tie us back to the Shemitah issue. And let's take a look. And here it says like this. So I'm going to skip a little. So Matkif la Yehuda braid Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. So, okay. So what was the conclusion? The conclusion was Beit Sha'an is not sanctified or is not part of Israel. And therefore you don't have to take Trumah and Masrot. So the Gemara says, but this was challenged. Umiga liman amar the Beit Sha'an lav me'eretz Yisrael. So does anybody say that how could Rebbe say such a thing? How can you say that Beit Sha'an is not part of Eretz Yisrael? There's a verse, right? The verse from Yehoshua. And what is the verse? Excuse me, Shoftim. V'aktiv, v'lo harish Menashe Beit Sha'an bet b'notev, Tanach bet b'notev. So Menashe was supposed to conquer it. He did not successfully conquer, meaning not Menashe, the person, the tribe of Menashe. But clearly, if he was supposed to conquer it, it was in the land of Israel. So now we're back to this question of Beit Sha'an. It says, okay, but the verse tells you it was in the land of Israel. So what's the answer? So the Gemara
Rabbi
says,
Linzer, I'm very sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind you there are 10 minutes left.
oh my gosh. Okay, fine. All right. I thought you were also going to remind me to take a breath. Because I actually am going maybe a little too fast for people. I hope not. Ishtamitete Hadamar Rabbi Shimon ben Eliyakim Yishum Rabbi Lezer ben Menashe. He forgot the following teaching, and this teaching explains why Beit Sha'an was not obligated in Trumot and Ma'asrot. And here we get to the punchline for us, and it says the following: Harbe krachim kavshum olei Mitzrayim below kivshum olei Bavel. Many cities were conquered, by those that came up from Egypt. In the time of Yehoshua and the judges, they were, they were won in war, and we took dominion over them. But they were not again conquered at the time when they returned in the time of Ezra. So we, maybe obviously there were, the non-Jews were present and we lived in them, but we didn't really take them under our control. Now, why is that relevant? The Kasavar. The sanctity, their first sanctity at the time of Yehoshua was good while they were in the land, but it is not permanently meaningful. When they were exiled, the land of Israel lost its sanctity for these laws of agricultural laws. When they re-entered at the time of Ezra, they had to re-sanctify it. So what's relevant for us for Trumot and Masrot is not the fact that you can find a verse in Yoshua or Shoftim. What's relevant for us is the question of whether it was reconquered at the time of Ezra. Now, you could just end there and say it was not reconquered at the time of Ezra. Then it would be an interesting Gemara and completely irrelevant for our purposes. But the Gemara actually says something that's mind-blowing if you appreciate it. And he says, that they intentionally did not re-sanctify certain areas. Why did they not re-sanctify certain areas? So that the poor could survive during Shemitah. So what does that mean? They did not make certain areas have the sanctity of Israel. So when the Shemitah came, what could you do during that year in those areas? If it's not Shemitah, what can you do? You can work the land. Now, how is that helping the poor? So in addition, they said that will be a year, the Shemitah year in these areas will be a year where you give the tithe to the poor. You give the general gifts of like things that are forgotten in the field, and you give the tithe to the poor. So listen to what the rabbis are saying. I just want us to appreciate this, right? It's like, how are we going to take care of the poor during Shemitah? Well, the Torah's way isn't going to work. Because if we're not working the land, they're really not going to get provided for. So sure, the Torah says that we're supposed to do it. You know what? It's not going to work. The only way we can take care of the poor during Shemitah is to not keep Shemitah, to not sanctify the land, and then rabbinically to say you have to give a tithe to the poor. That'll achieve the Torah's goal. Okay? Now, that is pretty audacious, to acknowledge that the Torah's goal is being subverted by the Torah itself. And that the Torah's goal, the way the Torah sets it up, Shabbat and Shemitah are at cross purposes. And if we care about the Shemitah dimension, we as the rabbis have to step in. We're not going to override the Torah, but we're going to create a little bit of a loophole. And we're going to not sanctify certain areas so we can work the land and so the poor can be provided from this land. So, this, I think, really goes back to the theme in which this passage opened. Like, not just how can you destroy this thing that Moshe made or that the previous kings didn't make? How can you say Beit Sha'an is not sanctified? It's like, how can you basically subvert the Torah and say we're better off not to keep Shemitah? Okay, and the answer, again, not overriding, but finding a way to subvert it. And the answer is that very Beit Sha'an that Rebbe was saying is like not obligated. Rebbe was really repeating this. He was freeing this land, and that Rebbe was working against his, forefathers, and the rabbis, or Ezra was working against almost the Torah. Better to not sanctify the land so that the poor can be provided for. So they are faced with two mandates, Shemitah and Shabbat. And they say, we really can't embrace them both equally. It sounds like in the Torah you do both, but you know what? Then the Torah's own goals are not going to be satisfied. So we're going to do Shemitah in major parts of the land, and we're going to do, Shabbat in major parts of the land, and then in other parts, we're not going to do Shabbat. We're going to not sanctify it, let the land be worked, and there Shemitah will achieve its true, realization. So, as I said, this is tremendously audacious, but at a certain level, it's also saying it's our mandate to fulfill the Torah's vision. And who knows, maybe in biblical times, you didn't work the land and there were miracles and plenty of food grew by itself. I don't know how it worked in the time of the Torah, but right now, looking at our reality, this is what we have to do, how we have to step up to realize the dual visions of the Torah. And I want to end by two thoughts. One is that we have something very similar by the loans, right? By Pruzbul and the loans of Shemitah, because the Torah says, release the loans. And that way, the poor will be not in debt. Comes Rabbi Akiva and says, actually not Rabbi Akiva, Hillel, and he says, that's not so good. And because now I'm going to say it incorrectly first, that's not so good because then all the people with money are out of their loans. So we'll invent Pruzbul, this type of a loophole and a technicality that will allow you to keep your loans and not erase them through Shemitah. So said that way, he's really subverting the Torah. But that's not actually what the Mishnah says about what Hillel did. It says Hillel saw that the people were violating Torah law. How are they violating Torah law? Because since they knew the loans would be annulled, what did they do? They didn't lend any money to the poor. And the Torah says you have to lend money to the poor, even when you know that the loans will be annulled. Well, yeah, that's a nice thing to say, but excuse me, I'm not going to lend you $1 million, 3 months before Shemitah. All right. So people were violating lending money to the poor. So here we have the same thing. The two visions of the Torah were at cross purposes. You want to lend money to the poor. You want to annul their debts. If you're going to annul their debts, good luck getting people, especially with like a year to go, to lend money. The Torah says you're not supposed to pay attention to that. Okay, but in the real world, we can't do both. So if we can't do both in the real world, comes Hillel and says, how are the poor better off? Not how are the rich better off. How are the poor better off? Are the poor better off to not have anybody lend them money? Or are the poor better off to have the loans, but then still have to pay them after Shemitah? So I think the obvious answer is the second. If nobody is lending them any money, what good is it? Okay, so money is available, but you'll still have to pay back. So how do we recognize the balance between these two visions? We create Pruzbul. So it's really this sense of the sort of audaciousness of the rabbis, not just saying we don't like what the Torah says. They're saying the Torah has two visions about what is supposed to go on with the annulling of the loans and taking care of the poor, what's supposed to go on Shabbat and Shemitah. They actually, for us, work. I don't know how they worked in the Torah. In the world in which we live, they're at cross purposes. And we have to step up, like Rebbe stepped up, and find a way where both of those visions can be satisfied. So I know I have 2 minutes, but I will try to just end you with one idea, which is Rav Kook came up with the Heter Mechira. He said, well, not like he was the first to think about it, but he established that currently in Israel, you sell the land of Israel to a non-Jew. It's like such a crazy fiction, and then you can work the land. And said Rav Kook, we actually had 3 options in front of us. Option number 1 was, don't sell the land. Say this whole thing is a loophole. Don't sell the land. Of course, what that does is that destroys the yishuv and the agricultural sort of society that we're trying to build, and it leaves people without food. That's not a realistic option. Option number 2, right, is just say, let's rely on the positions that Shemitah doesn't apply at all nowadays. You don't even have to sell the land. There are positions that Shemitah doesn't apply. He says that's not acceptable because that undermines the sanctity of Shemitah. So the way in which we hold on to both of those things is we say, yes, Shemitah applies, but if you sell the land, you can sort of not have to apply it, to those areas, sort of like we didn't sanctify Beit Sha'an. So this is another example of saying there are things that are cross purposes. People need to survive during Shemitah, like the poor. The Yishuv needs to survive. But we can't ignore Shemitah. We can't pretend or rule that it doesn't exist, even though that's an option. What we have to do is find a way to embrace both. So for the rabbis, they embrace both by saying some sections of the land are Shabbat and some are Shemitah. Some Shemitah applies, some it doesn't. And Rav Kook said, Shemitah starts by applying, and then we sell the land, and that allows us to to embrace that aspect of taking care of ourselves, sustaining ourselves, and so on. So I hope that what you've sort of got from this, and I think we did a really good job without the source sheets. So, and apologies for those that the lack of English made it more difficult. I think what we got from this is that the Torah speaks about Shabbat and Shemitah. One is about the poor, or one is about letting the land rest. Those two actually, if you bring them together, don't work together, because Shabbat undermines Shemitah. If you're not working the land, the poor are not going to have much to sustain themselves. And comes along the Talmud, and in a passage where it's discussing the responsibility of religious and Torah and political leaders to step up when it's necessary, even against the practice that had been in place until now, it speaks about how the rabbis chose to leave sections of the land not sanctified, to acknowledge that Shabbat is a problem for Shemitah, and that we are going to have a section where we're going to take care of the poor and not do the Shabbat Haaretz. And that is how we will own our responsibility of realizing the Torah vision in the world in which we live and its current challenges. And we ended by seeing how this also plays out in terms of Hillel's Pruzbal, and it played out for Rav Kook in his deciding how to paskin, how to rule regarding the Yishuv and Heter Mechira. So I hope that gives you some help and clarity in terms of appreciating what Shemitah is and its different directions, and also this type of leadership and sometimes audacity that is demanded of rabbis when they are doing it as sort of to be true to the Torah and true to not only the halacha as a word of the Torah, but the values of the Torah and the vision of the Torah as well. Okay, so thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi Linzer. Would you like to take a question or two?
It's up to you, because I think you told me that I was told multiple times to slow down. So from the captioner. So I do apologize to the captioner, and I apologize to everybody who was following the captions. I did not see the chats before because I was in my own full screen. So anyway, so I hope that it was intelligible and that the caption was able to do a good enough job. What did you want to say? But do we have time, Aaron?
Yeah, I think 5 minutes is fine.
We do have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to, I see that we're officially over 12:30, but we'll give 5 minutes for any immediate comments. I'll let you feel them.
I'm looking for hands.
I think people are still absorbing because I was going so fast.
I see
Anyway,
a surprised reaction. Is that a question? Would you like to ask something, Frida?
Unmute. Me unmute. Okay. This is fabulous. This is, you don't usually hear good stuff like this. You don't usually hear stuff this good. I just is somewhat of a side.
I'm gonna get that down. You know,
you really don't. So the thing is, I mean, most of us, many of us love Rav Kook, and it's certainly something had to be done about it. But I'm not the most raving Zionist in the universe, but how can you sell the land? What if the guy doesn't want to sell it back?
right.
How can you sell? We finally got it back. How can we sell it? What are we thinking?
Right. So
Jesus.
that's a great question. And I think one could say, maybe this loophole is good to recognize the sanctity of Shemitah. But what does it do to recognize, if not the sanctity of the land, our sense of ownership over the land, that we can make such a fiction to sell it to a non-Jew? Actually, I think they found out that the non-Jew Arab they were selling it to for many years actually had a Jewish mother. So much for that.
Well, I think there must be a lesson there somewhere.
Yeah, so I think you're
Suppose
absolutely
the guy
right.
doesn't want to sell it back.
It's funny because the more now the chief rabbinate used to be more middle of the road, appreciate the broader sort of observant and non-observant community. In recent years, it's been very much right-wing leaning and, and not willing to endorse or having, going back and forth about this issue of the heter mechira, of selling the land. And the interesting thing is, it's like the opposites, the extremes meet, because you could not want to sell the land because you're such a Zionist that you take deep offense at selling the land, and you could not want to sell the land because you're so frum that you don't like this loophole and you don't want to sort of be dependent on this loophole. So I certainly identify with that, and I'm going to have to end by telling you all a joke, which is, so a Reform, conservative, and Orthodox rabbi get together and they decide we should find one thing, one halacha we can all agree on. So they decide, okay, we're going to agree that smoking is forbidden. It's an ugly, disgusting habit. It's bad for your health. Fine. So then they bump into each other a month later and they're all smoking. So they turn to, the Reform rabbi and say, why are you smoking? So he says, look, I know we took this vote. I know that's the halacha, but at the end of the day, we believe in autonomy and this is the decision that is right for me. Okay, so they turn to the conservative rabbi. Why are you smoking? He said, it's true, there's one version that was the decision, but if you look actually at the historical record, there are other voices there. So it's not so clear. So that's why I'm smoking. Okay. So then they turn to the Orthodox rabbi and say, okay, but what's your excuse? He said, me? Don't look at me. I sold my lungs to a guy.
Yep.
So there you go. Okay, I hope that joke did not undermine the whole shiur. It was great learning with all of you, and it should be wonderful learning for the rest of the Yemei Iyun. Thank you, Rabbi Berman, for all that you do. Thank you for keeping this running. Thank you, Aaron Wodowski, and thank you again to Rav Dadi for this was his brainchild, and it's really just wonderful to have all of you here.